Welcome back to Humankind. Today, in this video, it's part 2, where I'm talking about the bad. If you missed part 1, where I covered the good, you can check that out, links in the doodly-doo and the pinned comment. Without any further ado, though, let's jump into some of the things that I don't enjoy about Humankind, that I think it needs improvement or expanding on. I do think it's a great game overall, so don't get me wrong, I do just want to preface the video by saying that. Anyway, let's talk. So, first up, I want to talk about some issues with the combat system. While the combat system is admirable and easy to understand in terms of unit strength and movement, I think there are a couple of issues. Firstly, I've had some real difficulties with placing units, spawning the banner, and in general, manual combat. Manual combat has not been something that I've overly enjoyed. I find myself auto-resolving the battles. I find the spawn points a little bit clunky for the units. I'm not saying the overall system is deeply flawed or should be scrapped, but there's definitely some improvements around where you spawn and place your units in battle, and I think the overall battle mechanics could use a little bit of tweaking. I would build on that even further, actually, by saying that some elements around multi-civilization sieges and multi-civilization battles worry me a little bit as well. It's not something at this point that I've had an opportunity to have massive experience with, but it's quite unclear to me on how a battle where there's, say, 3 allied parties wanting to fight at once plays out. I think what tends to happen is that a lot of the movements end up being auto-resolved. So there is an issue not so much in single player, because you're probably not going to be doing joint sieges, and if you are, you don't really mind if the AI's units just get bundled in with yours. But in multiplayer, I think there are going to be some combat issues that are going to need to be addressed moving forward if we want combat, particularly where there are 3 or more parties within the warfare. If we want that to be fluid and if we want that to work properly, Humankind's going to need to work on that a little bit more, I think. Next up, I want to talk balance. So, balance is always a hard one, right? And it's difficult to just say a game has bad balance or a game has good balance. I think that overall Humankind's balance is actually quite good, but there are some real synergetic issues that are definitely going to need to be balanced over realistically probably the first 1, 2, if not 3 years of the game's life cycle. We're going to see a lot of Humankind is perfectly balanced, Humankind exploit. I think we're going to see a lot of that, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's game breaking, that sucks. If it's ruining a multiplayer experience, that sucks. If it's ruining a single player experience, that sucks. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that an unbalanced, unsynergetic game is a good thing, because it's not. It's bad. It's certainly where there are room for really game-breaking exploits, that sucks. Humankind is in a difficult spot because it's releasing with 60 different cultures across 70 different eras. I think it's going to lead to a lot of synergy issues. When we think about how players played the game, at its initial release, rather the Victor Open Dev beta or the open beta, the closed beta, we saw some overpowered synergies where you could move from one culture to another and really exploit like food bonuses and previous units. So something to think about moving forward, I think. It's not necessarily a dire issue right now, but I think it's going to need some work. I think it's definitely going to need some work. Right. Next up, I'd like to talk about something I've covered already before, so I won't dwell on it for too long, but that is late game thumb twiddling. I do find that the dynamic events, while they're incredible, they do sort of dry up a little bit. I've found already that I'm getting duplicates, although I think that I need to maybe just try some different playstyles a bit more, and I might find more, but the dynamic events, I think, don't scale well, right? In the early game, they don't need to be overly complicated, and I don't mind if I'm finding the same ones again and again to a certain extent, right? Think tribal huts in Civilization 6. That's okay. But late game, they really don't scale well. You end up with the same sort of rudimentary decisions while they're impactful and storytelling, that they're impactful for the storytelling and for the narrative, they don't add complexity to the late game that they need to. I've found that victory is either a foregone conclusion or loss is a foregone conclusion by the mid-game. I know I heard some of you, some really great comments and feedback when I put out on both the community channel page and on some other videos. We've talked about this before, and some of you brought up a really good point that actually late game thumb twiddling, or sort of a more sort of stagnant mid to late game, is not uncommon for this kind of experience, right? These kind of strategy games do struggle with it. How I think it could be improved, and I've talked about it already, so I won't dwell too much in a previous video, is basically through diplomacy and global events, okay? So first up, I think that the global diplomacy really needs to be refined in this game. There's not a lot of global diplomatic multi-culture diplomatic challenges. So yes, you can, trade deals and you can manage your borders, but there needs to be some kind of world congress, some kind of global diplomacy that has really significant impacts. And this flows nicely into my next point, which builds on that but also adds more, and that's about the dynamicness of the map. In the previous video, Humankind the Good, I talked about how I really enjoyed the art style and the UI of the map, and that remains true. But one thing that I don't like is that the map itself is not very dynamic. We have these hugely dynamic civilizations and cultures that can change up to 7 times throughout the course of the game and wildly change their cultural affinity, your gameplay plan moving forwards, and all sorts of things. But the actual map itself is very stagnant. It's a very stagnant map, it's got to be said. For example, where are the later game considerations for things like climate, pollution, waste? Where are these human impacts on the planet? Where are they playing out? Moreover, can I build giant infrastructure and giant structures on the map? I don't think so, but I think particularly as we move into the middle and late game, that those sort of feats of human engineering are important. Now, don't get me wrong, the wonders and the holy sites are one way of doing that, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later in the video. But there are definitely other ways, right? Why can I not build... Sorry, I'm stuttering my words, but why can I not build, for example, a canal, right? Think the Panama Canal in the real world, and various other canals exist, of course. Why can't I build those? Those human infrastructure, right? That human-centric, human-made infrastructure that is really sort of big geographical infrastructure, right? Geopolitical things. I'm not talking about building a granary in my city. I'm talking about fundamentally altering the map and changing the dynamicness of the map. Whether that's polar ice caps melting and new trade routes being made available, whether that's sea level rise plaguing my cities, or, like I say, whether that's human-made structures like sea level walls, like canals that connect territories that could previously not be connected, like advanced, massive infrastructures where we can house people or grow crops. There are ways that we can make the map more dynamic. That's, of course, not even considering natural events, right? I talked about it a little bit with sort of the man-made, human-influenced things like climate and pollution, but there are many other things, right? Think about Civilization 6's Gathering Storm expansion, for example. Where are the tornadoes? Where are the earthquakes? Where are the volcanoes? These things matter because they were hugely significant to the development of human civilization, okay? Everything from the fertility of land to areas that are safe versus aren't safe, and again, that constant changing. Again, my mind goes to climate change, right? Where we have cities that are and communities that are built on the coast that need to be thinking about moving elsewhere and settling elsewhere. And I think that's a massive part of the sort of the human experience. And how we've evolved over time, and I'd like to see Humankind take more advantage of that with a much more dynamic map. As I said, I will briefly touch on wonders. I think that they're massively powerful, and they take a huge amount of production, and so they should. However, one of the downsides is they're a little bit all-encompassing, and they can kind of be kingmakers. Getting a wonder can really make or break a game. And I think that while it's okay to have those things in a game, it's only okay if there are other things that can make or break it. Again, I go back maybe to the dynamicness of the map. I'm not sure what the solution here would be. It may be that we need different tiers of wonders, right? We need wonders that you don't necessarily have to claim with influence, but maybe there are more sort of simple and straightforward wonders that we can build that require less infrastructure, less development. Sort of more sort of simple and little things like a building that is significant and can only be built once in the world, rather than this massive big like Eiffel Tower structure that takes 100 turns to produce. Next up, I'd like to talk about the sea, and I'm just sort of going to say why. Now, in my good video, I talked about the fact that I like that the naval units sort of suffer from illness and fatigue if they're out in the middle of the ocean, particularly in the early game. I like that we can properly embark and disembark units. Those are all great, but actually, does the sea matter? The sea is always neglected. The sea is always neglected in these games, yet in the real world, the ocean makes up roughly 80% of the world's surface, and we use it every day in all sorts of ways, for our benefit and for its. And I'd like to see a little bit more added to the sea. Maybe we make the significance of naval units more impactful. I think one way to do it would be to open up rivers and actually have rivers like the Danube or the Nile in the game. These rivers that actually ships can pass through, right? Because in Humankind at the moment, rivers are purely just basically city features. I want to see different alluvial bodies. I want to see not just ocean, and it's open ocean or it's coastal, and that's it. I want to see ways to make the sea more engaging, to make naval gameplay more important, and I think that one way to do it would be to have big open rivers that actually flow through continents properly, and that can have naval units move up and down them. I think that's a really simple way to make the map a lot more interesting and engaging, and I'd like to see Humankind do that moving forward. Finally, I want to talk about the integration of storytelling. And for the record, storytelling is one thing, and having a narrative-driven and fluid experience is one thing that Humankind absolutely does fantastically well. But I think that we could see more integration in it. I think that it's lacking a little bit. One example that jumps to mind literally in my head right now is the integration with great people. Civilization has great people and they're there, and it's a reasonably good system. I think Humankind could really build on it, add a lot more nuance to it, and have some really historical figures in the game, be sort of woven through the game, and have them tied to certain cultures. So it's not this sort of rudimentary, I need to earn X number of points by this turn to claim this person who has this effect, but actually, let's maybe have some great people who can add to the storytelling narrative, right? So maybe you get a special dynamic event, and if you choose a certain thing, your civilization gets that great person that has a real affinity with that culture or with that civilization. Again, it's another way that I think Humankind could build on the narrative and have a more engaging gameplay experience, particularly in that mid and late game. That concludes Humankind the Bad, or perhaps Humankind the Interesting. I think these are areas where a game that is already good can turn into a game that is fantastic. I fear it might take a few years, and perhaps even some DLC, to fully flesh out the experience. But that's okay. If it's priced appropriately and it keeps a community active and engaged and keeps us interested and keeps the gameplay dynamic, I don't mind that so much. That concludes Humankind the Bad, Part 2 of my in-depth review of Humankind. Part 1, of course, being Humankind the Good. As I said at the start of the video, that will be available on the channel and in the pinned comment. That concludes this video. If you did enjoy it, please do consider subscribing to the channel. We are a growing community, and there'll be lots more Humankind content on the way. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.